to do something completely different now, something that, as the father of two kids in public schools, that I care about a lot, and that is, how do we figure out how the best teaching gets done and who the best teachers are so that our children stand the best chance of a productive and successful future, in addition to having the best possible school years that they can. Joining us to talk about it, Richard Giordano was a high school principal for over 20 years, most recently in the Boulder Valley School District, where my kids used to be. His first book is called Supercharged Learning, How Wacky Thinking and Sports Psychology Make It Happen. And actually, the foreword to that was written by Dr. Ben Carson. But we're here today to talk about Richard's new book, Ineptitude, Conformity, and Obfuscation, the Fraud of Teacher Evaluation in the Public Schools. Good morning, Richard. Thanks so much for being here.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, so why don't you first just briefly define the problem for us?
Well, the problem, Ross, and by the way, let me just start out by saying that I don't want anybody to interpret what I'm going to say as a criticism of principals or superintendents or school people in general. What I'm describing in the book is a circumstance which is acted on by a lot of players, some within the schools and some outside of the schools. I term this kind of a rough agglomeration of people as the education coterie. But what I'm describing in the book is a circumstance of teacher evaluation which is ineffective, broken, and doesn't work.
Okay, and what are the results for our kids and for the parents of our kids when there is a system that doesn't work when it comes to judging who's a great teacher?
Well, the obvious result is poor quality learning, things that aren't learned, and the result being in international testing of American students with students at other developed countries, United States falling 24th in science, 39th in math, and 23rd or 24th in reading. It's just that the learning isn't taking place. The testing measures things that are known, not much of what is taking place in the public schools today.
So is it typical that the principal in a public school is the one responsible for doing this assessment of teacher quality?
That is correct. Is the principal, and more typically in larger schools, there'll be the assistant principals as well. Those two are the people that do the actual evaluation, and neither is competent to do that in two varieties of ways. One has to do with what is being taught, the content, and the second area of ineptitude has to do with the way things are taught, or what is called a pedagogy.
Okay, so let's talk about both. I mean, I think it goes without saying that even if a principal were a former teacher and expert in something, let's say the principal used to be a physics teacher, that would maybe probably qualify him to maybe be a judge of another physics teacher, but maybe not even of another biology teacher, much less an English teacher.
Well, absolutely. That is the main issue in terms of the content area. With the vast array of curricular offerings today, German, French, Spanish, trigonometry, calculus, geometry, physics, biology, history, humanities, the visual arts, the English, computer science, business, vocational education, to take one person or a cadre of 2 or 3 or 4 people, principal and assistants, and expect that they are going to be able to adjudicate whether or not correct information is being taught, which really is the essence of education, that's just foolishness.
Okay, and then, so that's the content side. You also argue that principals can't really judge very well whether a teacher is actually a good teacher or using proper and effective methods?
That is correct, and a lot of that goes back to the universities and also hiring practices. It's really kind of a conundrum because people that are selected for principalships are not necessarily very good teachers or good teachers. All teachers that go into graduate schools to become principals are accepted. I interviewed a professor at Michigan State.
Say that again? Say that again?
Well, virtually all of the teachers, all principals are basically, in this country at least, former teachers.
Okay.
Not true internationally. England is making some changes in that, in taking people that are not former teachers as principals. But in this country, most all principals, virtually all, are former teachers who go to graduate training for a year for a master's degree typically, and then they are adjudicated to be principals, qualified. But that doesn't mean they were good teachers themselves or even know what good teaching is. Therefore, when they see it, do they know it? Not necessarily.
And, you know, it's interesting, I'm thinking about assignment of tasks and specialization and stuff like that. And I guess if the principal were given functions that didn't really require him to know what a great teacher was, then it wouldn't matter if he knew or didn't know. But if someone is given the responsibility of determining who are the good teachers and they can't do it, then you got a problem.
And that's the very problem that we have today, and it's been kind of an evolutionary process. The principalship came about in the mid-1850s, and they were never considered to be instructional or intellectual leaders. But when you talk to people today in the public schools, the mantra is that our principals are instructional leaders. And the fact of the matter is they are not and they cannot be. And it's not a criticism of individuals or people. It's a criticism of a circumstance which has evolved and has never been addressed by what I call the educational establishment.
Our special guest is Dr. Richard Giordano, who spent 26 years as a secondary school principal, including most recently in the Boulder Valley School District. His new book is called Ineptitude, Conformity, and Obfuscation, The Fraud of Teacher Evaluation in the Public Schools. Richard, who do parents believe is responsible for assessing the quality of teachers?
What I've found is a lot of parents don't even know who does that job. And if they realize that it's the principal, there's kind of a tacit assumption that because the principal is the quote-unquote leader of the school, that principal must have the resident abilities to do the job. But that's a whole other issue that I had discussed in the book, which is the issue of leadership and the absolute dearth of leadership in the public schools because principals are not leaders. Peter Drucker, the late business leader and management consultant, defined management as doing things right and leadership as doing the right things. And there's a grave confusion in public schools because principals are more managers than they're choreographers. They arrange and coordinate, but they don't lead. They can't lead. There's a lot of circumstances that preclude leadership.
Right. That's where I was going to follow up there. I wonder how much room they have to be leaders or whether they are constrained by superintendents, by school boards, and other things.
It's a complex quagmire, but if you listen to some of the media today and you watch the news stories that develop, most recently you're seeing a lot of stories about, for example, in Texas, a young girl wanted to become a boy and was in a wrestling tournament with girls and won like 2 state championships. You never heard the principal mentioned in that story. There was no leadership function there. Most every story you'll hear about circumstances in public education, you rarely hear about the principal. The principal is basically a bystander when it comes to leadership in the schools. And again, it's not a criticism of an individual or a person. It's a criticism of the way the circumstance is structured. And you're right, there are many circumstances, largely political, that have to do with principals not being able to exert leadership.
We've got about 1 minute left, Richard. One of the words in the title of your book is conformity. What does that mean in this context?
Well, what it means is that there are many actors that are involved in the public schools, be they in the schools themselves, teachers, principals, counselors, all of those people, or agents outside of the schools, educational institutions such as the National Association of Secondary School Principals, Elementary Principals, Association for Curriculum Development, athletic organizations like the Colorado High School Activities Association. All of these conform to promulgate the notion that the school's teachers are being effectively evaluated. And I spoke with a woman who is the head of evaluation in a large metropolitan school district, and when I talked about the issue of content, the subject matter inability to be evaluated by a principal, she quickly switched the subject and continued to do that to the process.
I've literally got 30 seconds. Is there a solution?
There is, and the solution is to take principals out of a role that they were never qualified to fulfill. If you don't have expertise in science or mathematics or geography, find people who do. Develop a cadre of people on the outside who can evaluate those subject areas, provide the input, and take that strain off the principal who can't do it in the first place.
Dr. Richard Giordano, his new book, Inaptitude, Conformity, and Obfuscation, The Fraud of Teacher Evaluation in the Public Schools. Thanks so much for being here, Richard. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate your work as well.
Good to be with you.
You too. We'll be right back.